Today on Week in Review, we recap an intense week in North American politics. Highway 16 will now have more internet access in the Northwest, and the forest industry is looking hopeful in the near future. Hello and thank you for joining us here on Week in Review, where we cover all the news here in the Northwest. We begin with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who called a news conference in Ottawa on Monday, where he ended up announcing that he will resign as both Canada's Prime Minister as well as the leader of the Liberal Party after a leadership contest takes place. Here's Damian Matthews with more details on what was said.
Despite best efforts to work through it, Parliament has been paralyzed for months after what has been the longest session of a minority parliament in Canadian history.
Trudeau went on to announce that Governor General Mary Simon has agreed with his request to dissolve Parliament until March 24th. The dissolution of Parliament means that the opposition parties will not be able to trigger an election, at least until the Liberals elect a new leader. NDP party leader Jagmeet Singh responded in a statement saying Justin Trudeau's Liberals let down Canadians, and goes on to say they're only focused on themselves and their political fate. Trudeau's announcement came following many months of speculation over whether he would step aside, as well as public calls from his party to step down. For CFTK-TV News, I'm Jaylene Matthews.
And although Trudeau's resignation may have come as a shock to some, two Northwest politicians are saying it's been in the works for a while. Here's Jaylene Matthews once again.
Both MP for Skeena-Bulkley Valley Taylor Bachrach and the current federal Conservative candidate for Skeena-Bulkley Valley Ellis Ross say Trudeau's resignation comes as no surprise.
Really, it was an untenable position where, a party that is so focused on their own inner workings and problems isn't in a position to defend the country at a time that is a really difficult one for Canada. When we look at what's happening south of the border and the threat of tariffs, this is an incredibly challenging time. So I'm glad to see that he finally made that tough decision. I think there's a real sense of relief in our communities. And now we're in a position to reflect on what it means to be Canadian and how we move forward together as a region and as a country.
Basically, what surprised me was it took so long. I mean, close to a year. And 8 confidence votes in the House of Commons to get to this day. So that's what really surprised me.
Ross says that the loss of the NDP's confidence over the holidays may have played into Trudeau's move.
The letter that went out from the NDP leader just over the holidays said that they had no confidence in the federal Liberal government. That might have had something to do with it, but you got to remember, the federal Liberal MPs were also voicing their discontent with the leadership that they were undergoing as well. So I think it was a combination of everything happening at the same time over the past year that actually led to that.
Bachrach says that in the current climate, he expects a spring election.
Oh, I have no doubt that we'll have an election this spring. I imagine it'll be early May. It looks like that's the timing that we're looking at. In many ways, it was unfortunate that the Prime Minister chose to prorogue Parliament because this is a very tenuous time when we see President-elect Bush coming in south of the border, threatening unprecedented tariffs and a situation that we haven't seen ever, really, when it comes to our southern neighbor. This is a time when we need a strong government in place that can stand up for Canadian values and Canadian jobs, and Parliament is part of that. So while there is still a federal government in place, the parliamentary oversight and the checks and balances that come with our parliamentary system won't be back in operation until March. So it's going to be a challenging time when it comes to the governance of our country.
For CFTK-TV News in Terrace, I'm Jaylene Matthews.
Now back on Christmas Day, the Prince Rupert RCMP got a noise complaint that eventually resulted in them discovering a fire that ended up consuming a portion of the Sherbrooke apartment complex, although everyone in the building was able to be evacuated safely. But a later investigation that looked into what caused the fire saw the police discover that the blaze was not an accident, but instead was deliberately started by someone. The police have since arrested an individual in connection with the crime, and charges of arson have even been approved by the BC Prosecution Services against the individual. The arrested man's name is Michael Dennis Ware. He is currently 30 years old, and as of right now, he is still in police custody, presumably awaiting further judgment for his alleged crimes. And after the fire displaced about 100 residents, the city has now put out a call for community support on their Facebook page. As of Wednesday, there are still 19 units and approximately 60 residents that have been impacted by the fire and are looking for other accommodations. The city is asking for any potential residents with available housing to consider renting to those displaced and to reach out to the North Coast Transition Society's Housing Outreach Program at 250-627-8959. Up next, how local politicians are reacting to current U.S. and Canada relations. Welcome back. As the federal government is facing a lot of instability during a critical time in politics, more than a few politicians are in the midst of addressing concerns about threats south of the border. Here's Jayleen Matthews with more information.
I know it's a time of great uncertainty, and that creates anxiety.
In the wake of the prorogued parliament, along with threats south of the border, Canadians are facing a difficult political climate. Conservative federal candidate for Skeena-Bulkley Valley, Ellis Ross, says that Canada can't afford to be taking the states lightly.
We had this great relationship with the United States for decades. But now there's back and forth animosity. And it's really between the leaders, between Canada and the United States. I think the first thing that any new prime minister's got to do is start to mend those relationships for the betterment of North America.
Forest Minister Ravi Parmar, who is in Terrace this week, says his ministry will have a plan for Trump's tariff threats.
Next couple of weeks, I'll be announcing kind of a Team BC approach to making sure that we're fighting for BC's interests on softwood lumber duties. And this really important topic. The Premier is leading the work on the Trump tariffs, but we know that even prior to the discussion on the infamous tweet that led to this barrage of comments back and forth around what a 25% tariff would look like, we already know that softwood lumber duties are going up considerably in 2025, which is going to be challenging for our industry and our sector here in British Columbia.
Parmar says it's important to hold the federal government accountable in supporting BC's forestry industry.
British Columbia has delivered not only for itself but for Canada as a place where people can create good paying jobs in forestry, and we need the federal government now more than ever to step up. They have not been stepping up. In the past, we've seen the federal government spend billions of dollars on battery plants in Ontario and hundreds of millions, if not billions, on other initiatives in Quebec and Alberta. And we are not seeing the same love here in BC. It's time that they step up and help support this very important sector. And I'm looking forward to working as part of a Team BC initiative that holds those folks accountable.
And Premier Eby says his government will warn our southern neighbors that those threatened tariffs would greatly affect Americans.
Make our case to decision makers in the United States that the proposed tariffs from the president-elect will mean a significant increase in prices for Americans around things like homes.
For CFTK-TV News in Terrace, I'm Jayleen Matthews.
In local news, a report from BC Assessment disclosed that Terrace is home to 6 residential properties that are top 100 in terms of value in the North Central BC's property assessments. Every Terrace property on that list are located in the lakefront neighborhood, and the report also mentioned that the average value of Terrace's single-family homes has increased by 8% from $448,000 to $484,000. Property value information for other municipalities can also be found in the list. Now, the newly appointed BC Forest Minister was visiting this Northwest this past week and said the forest industry is looking hopeful in the region. CFTK-TV's Jayleen Matthews has more of the details.
BC Forest Minister Ravi Parmar has been meeting with local workers, community leaders, and First Nations leaders in the lead up to the BC Natural Resources Forum to talk about the future of forestry.
I know that the closure of the Skeena sawmills and the uncertainty certainly hurt this community, and I think it was perfect to see the light, the sun shining, because I'm feeling optimistic, as is the community, about the future of forestry for this community in particular, but also for the region as well.
Parmar's very first decision he made as Minister of Forests was to approve a 10-year license tied to the Skeena sawmills for the Kitsim-Kalem First Nation.
So I know that they are in the early days of exploring what needs to be done. It's an older mill, so certainly more work is going to be needed to be done to be able to get it up to the standards that it needs to be able to deliver for workers and for families.
The Kitsim-Kalem First Nation purchased the mill last spring for $14.5 million and required that transfer of tenures in order to move forwards.
This was just one of many conversations I expect to have with the local nation about finding ways to be able to get the fiber to that mill, and hope that there'll be opportunities to be able to explore value-added aspects of it as well. We do ship a lot of raw logs from this area, and I know that the reason for that is there isn't much in the form of value-added opportunities, and I'm hoping to change that in my time as Minister of Forests.
Parmar will continue his tour of the North and plans to build local partnerships through forest landscape planning tables.
Looking forward to actually being at the table, at the FLP tables with industry, First Nations, and local leaders. I'm looking forward to talking about the work of the BC Wildfire Service as we plan for the 2025 wildfire season. I'm looking forward to talking about BC timber sales and the work that we're going to be doing to upgrade and make sure that it's delivering for workers. And the reality is I'm going to be looking forward to being on the ground, talking to people. Victoria, where I'm from, is not the center of the universe. When it comes to forestry, it's all of these forestry dependent communities. So it was really important for me to kick 2025 off with what I think is probably one of the most robust tours that a Minister of Forests has ever done.
For CFTK-TV News in Terrace, I'm Jaylene Matthews.
After the break, more cell phone coverage will be available here in northwestern BC. Welcome back. Well, residents of the northwestern area of BC recently got access to 160 more kilometers of cell coverage along Highway 16, with even more set to come in the near future. Once again, here's CFTK-TV's Jaylene Matthews with more on what that could end up looking like.
Almost 20 years and a few large industrial projects after it was recommended in the Highway of Tears Symposium Recommendations report, BC's notorious Highway of Tears has 160 kilometers more cell phone coverage. Rogers Communications announced in a statement they've turned on 5 new cellular towers along the 720-kilometer stretch of highway that runs from Prince Rupert to Prince George. 9 out of 11 planned towers for the highway are now in operation. Highway traffic has increased during the construction of the LNG Canada plant, along with other large energy and mine projects in the Northwest. This will likely continue with the number of projects on the go, as in Q1 2024, the North Coast region had a total of 53 major projects with a combined value of $119.6 billion in the works, with only 2 of those 53 projects being completed. The Highway of Tears Symposium report was submitted on June 16, 2006, in which limited cell coverage is identified, and it is recommended that the government and nations look into asking a telecommunications company to expand the incomplete cell service along the highway. Since the report came out in 2006, at least a dozen missing and murdered investigations have been linked to the Highway of Tears, including the still unsolved murder of Jessica Patrick Balser in 2008. Also that of Madison Maddie Scott, who went missing after a camping party in 2011. Her remains were finally found last year. And at least one of Cody Lejebakov's 4 convicted murders. The new towers are part of an ongoing rural wireless service expansion project with the province's Connecting British Columbia program. Rogers says the Highway 16 project is part of Rogers' commitment to expand services to underserved, rural, remote, and Indigenous communities in BC and across Canada. For CFTK-TV News in Terrace, I'm Jaylene Matthews.
And a new announcement has emerged from the Prince Rupert Port Authority, letting it be known that they have made a new addition to their board of directors. The person in question being added to the board is named Jean-Jacques Roust, and he has spent over 4 decades as a private sector executive with his experiences, including work in sectors like logistics, transportation, chemical manufacturing, as well as international trade. Roust was nominated by the Port User Nominating Committee. Now turning to more provincial news, with Justin Trudeau resigning in the middle of a tumultuous time with the U.S., the premiers are stepping up their game to tackle Donald Trump's tariff threats, and they're booking flights to Washington on a campaign to educate American politicians on what a disaster tariffs would be on both sides of the border. CTV's Rob Buffum reports.
Canada's premiers met virtually today, hashing out a plan to respond to President-elect Trump's tariff threats and agreeing to go to Washington, D.C. on a trade mission February 12th.
I think this is a healthy sign to see premiers stepping up. It's clearly an existential threat and an economic threat.
Premier Eby has already spoken with the governors for Washington State, Colorado, and Oregon, and in a statement he says, "I've asked for their assistance in ensuring Americans are fully aware of the additional costs they will be facing." Eby adding, while meeting leaders in Washington State next month, the premiers will outline the retaliation measures we're willing to take and the devastating impacts of these tariffs on both sides of the border. The looming economic threats as Trump continues his taunting calls to acquire Canada, posting these images on social media after saying Tuesday he'd like to use economic force to annex Canada.
Canada so far has been effectively saying, yes, we agree to do your homework for you. And as in any bullying relationship, when you give in to the request, you just invite more bullying.
With the Prime Minister soon resigning and Parliament prorogued, the premiers, notably Ontario's Doug Ford, are taking an active leadership role.
There is a vacuum now in Ottawa and a real concern of, without any real focus and leadership with the federal government on an international trade relationship.
Ford appearing on American news networks, campaigning for Canada, pushing back on annexation and tariff talk.
President-elect Trump is a real estate tycoon. He's made billions, but that property's not for sale. As simple as that.
The premiers are reconvening 1 week from today along with the Prime Minister to revisit strategy to combat Trump's tariff threats.
Still to come, we recap a busy week in Canada and U.S. politics. Welcome back to our final segment. Turning now to more shocking comments made by U.S. President-elect Donald Trump. He's ramping up the rhetoric about making Canada the 51st state. CTV's Rob Buffum recaps how this comment about using economic force is sparking plenty of backlash.
Premier Eby pushing back on President-elect Trump's calls to acquire Canada.
Canadians are proud. I'm proud to be Canadian. We are not becoming the 51st state.
Eby's comments right around when Trump was saying this about his desire to annex Canada and how he'd do it.
Economic force, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something. You get rid of that artificially drawn line, and you take a look at what that looks like.
That would horrify me. I don't want to be the 51st state. I am so proud to be Canadian.
I think they're forgetting history, and I do believe they lost the last war with Canada.
Canada is obviously facing a grave situation with Donald Trump, even to the point of calling it an existential crisis.
A day after announcing he's resigning, Prime Minister Trudeau blasted back online, tweeting, "There isn't a snowball's chance in hell that Canada would become part of the United States." The escalating war of words 2 weeks from Trump's inauguration, when he's promised to bring in massive trade tariffs. Eby isn't going to Trump's inauguration, but is planning a trip to the States with other premiers.
Make our case to decision makers in the United States that the proposed tariffs from the president-elect will mean a significant increase in prices for Americans around things like homes.
Adding to the crisis, Parliament is prorogued until March 24th. Leaving the fate of various bills and federal funding for BC programs potentially up in the air.
But I'll be blunt and frank in saying that we saw a lot of announcements of funding that weren't delivered to British Columbia.
As for Trudeau's successor, former BC Premier Christy Clark is rumored as one. someone Eby says he's butted heads with but would welcome in the race.
Ms. Clark will bring the discussion of BC issues and a BC focus that other candidates will have to respond to.
Among the growing list of other issues, including threats to Canada's sovereignty.
And with the Liberal Party in turmoil, the federal Conservatives are surging to a level of popularity that hasn't been seen this century. As CTV's Reagan Hasegawa explains, the Tories now have unprecedented support from BC voters.
More than half of British Columbians would vote Conservative if a federal election were held today. Those results staggering, even to political pundits.
54% of decided voters saying I would vote for the Conservatives. Stephen Harper was forming governments, 2 minorities, 1 majority government, and never had this level of support.
So why are most British Columbians now leaning to the right?
There's a lot of people who seem to be dissatisfied with what the center-left is offering, either in the form of the Liberals or the NDP.
I just can't keep living here with the cost that everything is. I just can't keep doing it, so I have to do what's right for myself, and that's to get my cheaper rent, my cheaper groceries, and that's, as far as I understand, that's what voting for Pierre will get me.
I'm First Nation. None of them help my people. Why should I vote?
The poll suggests the Tories are leading across the country, with the exception of Quebec.
It certainly suggests that the situation for Justin Trudeau was untenable. It was going to be very difficult to come back from the levels that the Liberal Party has right now.
The survey was conducted on the weekend before the Prime Minister officially resigned.
It's not because things are going wrong, that's not his fault, you know? Another one is going to come, it's not going to be any better.
But is it too late for the Liberals to bounce back?
The most important issue is to establish an emotional connection with voters. I think we see a little bit of that with the Pierre Poilievre Conservatives, very quick, easy to memorize slogans.
And experts say a good campaign could still change the political landscape before voters head to the polls. Reagan Hasegawa, CTV News, Vancouver.
Now that Trudeau has paused Parliament, any legislation not yet finalized will essentially go belly up. But that hasn't stopped the Canada Revenue Agency from enacting proposed tax changes that may never actually become law. CTV's Ben Milger explains.
And it's time for a reset.
When Justin Trudeau announced his impending resignation and prorogued Parliament, he left the Liberal legislative agenda to wither in the wind. That includes a motion which would hike the amount of capital gains tax Canadians pay on the sale of assets and investments.
If you believe that these proposals are likely not going to pass, then why blindly encourage taxpayers to comply?
It's a good question, especially considering that is exactly what the Canada Revenue Agency is doing. Parliamentary convention dictates that taxation proposals are effective as soon as the government tables a notice of Ways and Means motion. This approach provides consistency and fairness in the treatment of all taxpayers, the Department of Finance said in a statement. The CRA expects Canadians to file under the proposed changes rather than the existing law. With a spring election likely, the next government could scrap the planned increase altogether, but not before the April 30th tax deadline.
To the extent that this proposal doesn't become law and you filed on that basis, now you got to amend and you got to wait for a refund.
And that might be easier said than done.
Anybody who has experience with waiting for refunds from the CRA, it's not a pretty experience. It's a great game of wait.
People can try to file under last year's rules, but in the unlikely event the next government proceeds with the capital gains increase, they'll have to pay interest and face potential penalties. Ben Milger, CTV News, Vancouver.
That wraps up this week's edition of Week in Review, and make sure to tune in to our regular newscasts on Monday at 5, 6, and 11 o'clock here on CFTK-TV. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have a good night.